Good evening, everyone. A quorum is present, so we will begin the January 2024 meeting of the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board. I have a suggestion for a couple of changes to the agenda, so I'd like to make a motion to amend the agenda. Is there a second?
Second.
All right. The changes I'd like to make would be moving item 7B, which is the Central Park Cultural Landscape Assessment, which is scheduled for 15 minutes, to go in front of matters from discussion information, which is the proposed Civic Area Historic District. And the reason for that is that will be the CLA is a subcomponent of the Civic Area Historic District evaluation, and will be it would make sense to get that done first before going over the entire evaluation under matter 6A. And the other change I'd like to make is adding a discussion of the retreat agenda and their matters from the board, item 8, adding a D to that portion of the meeting. Is there any discussion on these two proposals? Jason, are you able to unmute and speak?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, I can barely hear you. Can you speak again?
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, adequately.
Okay.
Good if the volume could go up a little more, but I think they're working on it here.
Okay.
Okay, do you have any comments on the proposed changes to the agenda?
No, I was going to ask to add to what you just proposed to add to for the retreat agenda to be added at the end. So thanks for doing that.
Yeah, item 8D under matters from the board.
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, all in favor of the changes to the agenda, say aye.
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 Okay, that passes. Next up, we have future board items and tours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Allie Rhodes, Director of Parks and Recreation. I'm going to sketch out just a few key milestones for February and March. One, I just wanted to flag under the just other events, and this will come up briefly under your matters from the board, but PRAB recruitment is open. It closes, I believe, on the 29th, and sometimes encouragement and wayfinding with current board members is the best way to find new board members. And so we just encourage you to help us find really great people who care about the community and make sure the PRAB continues to be as wonderful and helpful as it has been. Those appointments will come in March at the city council meeting. And then as far as topics for you to be aware of, I think I'm sorry, I was doing tech things and I'm not as prepared as I normally am for this portion of the meeting. You have several discussion items coming up that will then lead to action items. And so just want to remind you all how helpful it is when we're aware of your attendance, whether you will be in person or virtual or not in attendance, so that we can make sure we have a quorum for those meetings where we will be taking action. And then I also wanted to flag for our chair that we are excited in February. We're going to be talking about how we talk about climate emissions reporting and alignment, and that'll also connect to our Violet Park project. So I know that has been a request from the board, and we were able to figure that out and look forward to that conversation.
Great, thank you very much. Next up, we have public participation. Yeah, please go ahead.
Allie, are you able to share how many applicants you've had to this board so far?
We are at 2 at the moment.
And we have 1 opening?
We have 2. You'll learn more that, or I guess it's not a novel. There's no need to wait for a surprise. Anita shared with us last week that she's resigning effective immediately. And so we have a vacancy now, and then we'll have another when Chuck's term ends at the end of March.
Thank you.
Typically, we average anywhere from 8 to 12 applications for 1 to 2 seats.
And then Jason continues?
Yes. Well, his term continues. And as far as I know, yes.
It's a heavy lift to be on 2 different boards at the same time.
Rosa, do we have anyone signed up for public participation yet? Okay, since there's no one signed up for public participation, we'll just skip that section of the agenda. And we'll move on to the consent agenda. As usual, we'll start with a motion to approve the consent agenda, which consists of the minutes, the design and construction updates, and the recreation updates. Would someone like to make a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
And a second?
I'll
Second.
second, Jason.
Okay, thanks, Jason. So are there any discussion of amendments to the minutes or to any comments or questions regarding the design and construction updates and the operations updates? And did Sunny ever come online? I just want to know who's here and who's not. Okay, would you please let me know if you do see her? Thank you. I do have one comment. I wanted to thank Ally for the discussion she had with City Council about the civic area Phase 2 development. I watched that video and it was very nice how you presented that, and seemed like council was very receptive and had some good feedback.
They had really good feedback, but I have to flag that Mark Davison, Shihomi Kuriagawa, colleagues from Planning and Development Services, I really shouldn't get the credit. We have an incredible team working on this project, and I share your excitement for it. It's
I
gonna
meant
be
you
awesome.
and your team. Okay, we have a motion to approve the consent agenda and a second. All in favor of approving the consent agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Oh, I'm sorry, Jason. I missed you.
That's okay.
Okay.
It wasn't a very important question. I wanted to note, it looked like somewhere in the consent agenda, I forget the page. Looked like it was the chart showing the, different, sorry, let me try to find it here. The number of people going to the rec centers, and it was really encouraging to see the 2023 numbers get close to pre-pandemic numbers. And so congratulations to Ally and the team and everyone for everything you've done. I joined the board 2 weeks after the pandemic started, so to see the trajectory is really incredible. So well done.
Actually, I'm sorry. Jason reminded me of a question that I had. The that same chart, which is on page 11, notes that there's still a 6,000 person visitation gap. Is that from the peak in 2019? Okay, thank you. I agree with Jason. It's encouraging to see these numbers.
I've been at East a lot this month, and I can't wait to see January numbers. It feels like a recreation center. It's really exciting.
Great. Okay, moving on from the consent agenda, we'll go to the revised agenda. We'll now have a discussion on the Central Park Cultural Landscape Assessment.
Mark Davison, our senior planning manager, is going to present this item. And I think, are you presenting from you're ready to go then?
That's funny. Jason, your hand's still up. Oh, got it.
Hi, Mark Davison, Senior Planning Manager at Parks and Recreation, and I'll be presenting on the Cultural Landscape Assessment for Central Park tonight. I just realized it's been maybe 3 or 4 years since COVID, since I've been up here, and I've got a 15-minute time limit, so Ali's going to put the timer on me just in case. I'm going to cover, as you can see on the slide tonight, 5 items: the CLA process, a little bit of the methodology, and we know this is new for us, a cultural landscape assessment. The HIP report we did, which the board reviewed, was almost like an overview of a cultural landscape or historic preservation for our various sites. This dived into a lot more detail, so try and demystify some of the language around this process. Then we'll dive into the evaluations, the findings, and then the next steps. The staff who've worked on this include the historic preservation staff at BPR, including the supervisor for that, Tina Briggs, and Shihomi Kuriagawa, who was mentioned earlier, has been as the project manager on the civic area. And then we've also worked with our PNDS staff to pull this report together. What you can see here is contents of the CLA, which was the appendix in the PRAB memo. And the things I've highlighted in yellow are the items where we'll dive into detail directly from the report. I think it's good rather than just sort of a summary of findings is to pull the direct findings. And that's the methodology, a description of the study boundary, how we analyze existing conditions, and this thing called significance and integrity that we need to get to, where you need both to ultimately have sort of historic value for the site. I won't spend long on this slide because you've actually seen this before, but it's basically the process that we used. We last came to you in December, which I still unfortunately have shown up as today. It is actually January now. We basically, with the CLA, developed this as staff and then asked for a consultant in historic preservation, MIG, to review it in terms of collaborating with on content, ensuring we had the right methodology, and then ultimately this January, they certified the findings of the CLA. So the methodology, there is two aspects to looking at a cultural landscape assessment. And you'll see there, what I'm showing up top is where for a historic district, the code developed the idea of significance being things that are historic, architectural, and environmental. The CLA takes a slightly different track in that it follows significance according to the Secretary of the Interior standards. And actually, when I get to it in a moment, the two historic periods that were identified as having, one is having potential significance and one is having significance, were for criteria A, associated with events, and criteria C, distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method from that particular two periods. And so you'll see on the left that National Register Bulletin, that is what the Secretary of the Interior Standards uses to develop criteria for historic districts. And then on the right is the Cultural Landscapes Reports that was developed to help us understand significance for not just buildings, but the landscape itself. And what I mean by that is when you start to think about something like the integrity of a landscape. So initially looking at significance, you're saying something's historic from what period, is that important to us? The integrity then says, well, okay, it's important to us, but what's left of that period today that would convey what is important about the site? And that's the physical features. That's the key part of understanding integrity. And basically, in the 90s, the National Park Service recognized the initial efforts with the National Environment Preservation Act had a focus on buildings and then on historic districts that were mostly groupings of buildings. So the document in blue, a cultural landscape report, Guide 2, started to develop the idea of, well, let's look at landscapes as systems, characteristics, and you'll see me talk through that tonight. So whereas at the top, you'll see that in our code, we don't specifically have guidance on integrity, but it does guide us back to the National Register, which is the bulletin on the left, and that was developed in 1997. And then in 1998, the blue document, Guide to Cultural Landscape Reports, said use the document on the left, the bulletin, but for landscapes, use the document on the right. And then when you get to the end, go back to the document on the left to sort of finalize your assessment. A little bit clunky, but it's the method and we all follow it. And when you sort of demystify it, it's actually quite a good, well-developed method that's well used across the US. So here's the methodology in a nutshell and how we laid it out. First of all, do a chronological history. Once you've done that, you can then identify specific historic periods, look at the existing conditions. And the idea is then to say, which features are historic from that period or periods and which are non-contributing from it. Once you've got that in place, you're able to do your evaluation of significance for those historic periods. And then for the integrity, you look at the contributing and non-contributing features to understand if they allow the landscape characteristics to convey integrity. And once that's in place, you move to the last part, which is looking at the 7 aspects of integrity. And from that, you produce findings. So here's the study area in blue on the left, and that is Central Park. And then what you see on the right in green is the historic area identified by the CLA. And I'll explain that as I go into it further. The 4 historic periods identified were acquiring the land at the back end of the park, and then at the front end was the modern updates. The 2 periods which we really realized had significance were the 1923 to 36 Olmsted, and that is potential significance. It hasn't yet been confirmed, but we identified the potential. Whereas 1937 to 1973 had already identified significance, and we were able to affirm that. And this is just basically summing that up in a nice little diagram to show you that it, as step one, when we identified for this progress, does it have significance, Central Park? We were able to say yes for the Olmsted period and yes for the Huntington-Boer period, but no for the other two periods. Therefore, when we do an integrity analysis, we look at the middle two periods that have the green check mark. So I see some nodding heads, so I'm feeling good that I'm making progress. What happened next was then, as I described, here's an evaluation of Central Park for non-contributing and contributing features for that Olmsted period, 23 to 1936. And you do it for various things like topography, vegetation in terms of trees in the middle, ground cover in terms of vegetation on the right. And you're basically using blue to say it's contributing and red to say it's not contributing. And then the darker shade is it wasn't actually built out of the design. The lighter shade was it disappeared over time. And ultimately, when we did this for the Olmsted period, although we were excited by the fact that the significance of it being a potential Olmsted Junior Park, unfortunately, as you see on the right, the landscape characteristics pointed to there not being integrity. Too many features had been missing over the years, had disappeared, had been overlaid with new structures in the modern era. And frankly, even the bandshell overlaid the historic park, so you lost that sense of it. For the next period, 1937 to it's funny, the little black thing is in the image, and I really should know it off by heart, and I think it's 1975. This is the Huntington-Boer period. And what you see here is the contributing features from that period are the bandshell, the seating area, the circulation of the two diagonal paths to the left and right, and then coniferous trees behind. They were the major features that were added during that period from Huntington doing the design and then De Boer locating where it would go. And there wasn't actually non-contributing features in the sense of from that those designers. There was obviously things like rail trucks added that then disappeared, but they really weren't part of the significance of the site. And so when we evaluated and think about this, the landscape characteristics for the 7 aspects of integrity, we can see that on the left, we're unfortunately not seeing integrity for Olmsted, but we are for Huntington. What's interesting about this is we are a certified local government, and the current code, for example, does not point to give direction on how to do integrity. Instead, it points to the National Park Service for guidance. So that was part of the CLA to say, and I mentioned that earlier with the bulletin, the black bulletin document, and then the blue cultural landscape report guide. We were able to follow those guides to understand the integrity. And we know this research and evaluation within the CLA will be used to help inform when you get to the guidelines in the historic district, which our colleague Marcy will be presenting later. So what are the findings? Well, this is actually taken directly from the cultural landscape assessment, and it outlines in green the area of the park where there was historic significance and integrity identified for the 1937 to 73 period. And then unfortunately, for the Olmsted period, we do have significance, but we don't have integrity. And that's where the National Secretariat standards are pretty clear that you need, as you see in that line there at the bottom of the 3rd paragraph, a property must be determined historically significant and retain sufficient historic integrity to be historic. So that's where the information from the CLA landed. I've sort of gone through that fairly quickly. Feel free to read the 70 pages, bedtime reading, to get a better sense of the report. And I'm happy to answer any questions that come up on the technical aspects of this. It's been a really great collaborative process. And also, frankly, when you're introducing a new type of report, we've had to really think it through and collaborate. And we know there's some next steps to really focus on alignment on how we figure out integrity and guidelines for a potential future district. But I would say the interesting thing about the cultural landscape assessment for parks, it is a multi-tool kind of Swiss knife style document. And I've just listed some bullets there for what it'll be used for and next steps. Like I've talked through just in this presentation, we really do get to the contributing and non-contributing features in the existing conditions. That's critical because then you know from each period what is historic and what's not historic, and that's that existing conditions analysis. Basically, we've potentially established a really good practice for evaluating design cultural landscapes, aka parks, in Boulder. We haven't really had that before, except for the overview with the HIP. So this is hopefully a good precedent for us to collaborate on as a city when we think about these types of landscapes. And what is interesting is because landscapes came into being only in really as a guideline in 1998, in the last 25 years, they've really come into being as a way to evaluate not just the buildings, but the landscape itself. And the reason I say that is, if I can give an example, that I mean, it was Penn Station being knocked down in New York that led to the National Historic Preservation Act in 1960. The guidelines developed initially really were for buildings, and it was folks at the National Park Service looking at national parks and at state parks and frankly city parks said they don't really convey how to assess the systematic aspects of a landscape like circulation, like topography, like vegetation. So that's why this cultural landscape guideline has come into being. And it does really dovetail nicely with the buildings assessment as well. So we see it for parks in Boulder being a helpful guide. It also, obviously, as we move into the Civic Area Phase 2 project, can be a very helpful guide for thinking in the context of that. And it is one of the principles to look at the historic aspects of the civic area. So this will help inform it. It's also critical. You can typically do a historic preservation maintenance plan for a park using something like a cultural landscape assessment. So you're thinking of the best ways, for instance, if you're looking at those two paths to maintain them in their historic state, while making sure you incorporate things like ADA guidelines, et cetera, like modern uses. And then in terms of the civic area itself, the CLA through the chronological history and the identification of the historic periods with all the graphics and images and plans is really helpful in the interpretive story, whether that's media, a guide out there, or a website. So it also informs that side of it, which isn't the historic physical side of it, but it's really the telling the story side. And like I mentioned, the last part of this, which has been the purpose that set us off on this track initially, was to help support the historic district information informing of the boundary, the guidelines, and everything else that comes with that. And it's been a pleasure working with our staff to try and get to this point. And we know with this new method, we've got things to learn as we go through the process, but we think it'll set us up good in the future for anything else that comes down the pipe. And with that, I'll conclude the presentation.
What Mark didn't say is that I put him on a timeline because he knows more about this topic than I'll ever learn or forget. A significant part of his career so far has been with the National Park Service. One of his first offices was at Frederick Law Olmsted's house in Brookline, Massachusetts. He's helped with historic districts in the Park Service all over the country. And so doing that so well and succinctly was a challenge accepted and well met. Thank you.
Thank you. I do tend to waffle sometimes, so Ali keeps me under the gun. And with that, I'll pass you over to, is it Brad now? And Marcy will come up.
Yeah, well, let's pause for a minute and just see if anyone had questions before you just disappear.
That's a good point.
And what I'd like to do tonight, since we have some members who are remote, is to give the remote members a chance to speak first. That way they aren't just trying to interject and raise their hands and not be seen. So Jason, you want to have first crack at it? And Sunny, if she's online yet. Okay, Jason.
Sure. I do have a question. I think I don't know if this is the right time or if there's more to come. I missed what's after this, Mark or Ali. And this is kind of related to the conversation we had in December, but just this process. I was reading through the presentation. It says that it does obviously create new additional kind of bureaucratic hurdles. Rightfully so in some cases. But how would this process thinking ahead impact the Civic Center phase 2 that we were looking at, that we toured in the fall? I know there's kind of conflicting things I've seen from the packet and from things that it's a fast process. It's not a big hurdle, but it is another layer. And so just curious. And again, if this question is better discussed at a later point, I'm happy to hold on to that too. I just was curious about the intersection there.
I think I would recommend that we hold that question off unless you have something specific about the cultural landscape assessment that Mark was speaking to.
Oh, sorry. I thought I didn't know where we were on this process, but.
No,
Yep.
and then we're going to have another presentation on the proposed Civic Area Historic District that will follow. And then that would be a great time for that question.
a simple answer would be just to answer it is the CLA gets to, as it were, the historic features on the site, the contributing features as they call that. And there was a grayness before that about that. And with the historic district analysis as well, we'll be able to fully establish what is historic, what isn't. And that's critical, isn't it? Same as natural resources, you want to establish what the 100-year, 500-year floodplain is in order to make decisions. Hopefully between the historic district and the CLA, we'll have a tool that can do that for cultural resources as well.
Yeah, I think this is a great background and preface to the deeper discussion we're going to follow on with. So do you have any comments, Bernie?
I have two. And first of all, I just want to thank you very much for the assessment. It is interesting, and I appreciated your summary because the reading was very interesting, but also quite dense and long. But the ultimate conclusion points, just to make sure I understood you. This is not historic, right?
I want to be really clear. The identification in the CLA points to, you've got to, for Secretary of the Interior standards for integrity says you need to look at the 7 aspects. What the CLA pointed to was that there was integrity for the Huntington de Boer period, which we pointed out earlier in one of the slides, the analysis on that. But there was, unfortunately, not his integrity for the Olmsted Junior period, which led the period of significance to be from 1937 to 1933, which aligns with what you'll see for the historic district. So the historic area of the site will, in the CLA, is identified as the northern third, but the historic district will need to analyze integrity for the historic district as a whole. That's a little bit of a nuance, but you'll hear that in the next presentation.
Okay, thanks. So I have one other question that's a little bit more philosophical, but we now understand that as storied as his achievements are, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. was a somewhat problematic figure. As someone who worked at a space dedicated to him, can you speak at all about how that history was handled at your past job?
Oh yeah, I see. No, I mean, I've got to be honest, it was 25 years ago, and unfortunately the conversation wasn't in the forefront for that type of conversation. I am pleased to say Charles Birnbaum, he came up at the last meeting. He's head of the Cultural Landscape Institute, and actually him with Bob Page, who wrote the Cultural Landscape Report, were colleagues together. And Charles Birnbaum recently gave a lecture in Denver revisiting specifically Olmsted Jr. as noting where there's been gentrification and the destruction of communities that were typically underserved. So I would say in the last few years, that's really started to come to light. And I think it'll bring, frankly, a new light on how we analyze these landscapes.
Thanks, Mark.
Appreciate it.
While we transition, I'll just add one thing to that comment, that the fact that there's not so significance in the way I translate it is, yes, it's old, but is it special? Right? Like, because there's stuff all over Boulder that is old. That doesn't mean it's special. That's the significance part. And then the integrity, what of it is, in what condition is it in? For Olmsted, it's not there. So in a way, I would say, and you'll hear from the story map and the great work that the Plan Development Services team has done, that yes, and I also think that Frederick Law Olmsted and the Olmsted brothers did a significant amount of work to advance the field of landscape architecture and the values of parks, and that's there. But what I'm dancing around delicately is we won't be celebrating this as an Olmsted Park because it doesn't have the integrity. And so the story can really be about from the time Boulder was settled, and certainly even in time immemorial, it's been a place where nature is important and parks are important for the settlement. And so the Olmsted period doesn't have that integrity, but the Huntington de Boer does. So that'll be more of the story with the historic elements, as much as, this will be a good segue to introduce Brad and Marcy, that the history actually begins even before that. I saw you point, did you have a question, Hannah?
I didn't have a question. I just wanted to say thank you to Mark for a great presentation. That made it a lot easier to understand than the content of the packet.
Thank you. And
We've all learned a new language with this.
but I would acknowledge the team that went into making this, and that is deeply appreciated.
Yeah, great. All right, Mark and Marcy are going to transition. Marcy Gerwing is a principal planner with the Planning Development Services. She's going to join us up here. She has, I guess, the city's chief historian, for lack of a better translation. And then Brad Mueller is my colleague and counterpart, the Director of Planning and Development Services. And he's going to introduce this for us.
Yes, thank you, Allie. And thank you so much for the invitation to talk to you all again. I want to speak very briefly just to give some context to Marcy's much more thorough and comprehensive discussion. But just as we had the opportunity to come talk to you and preview this, we're excited this evening to give you a overview of our preliminary findings relative to the application, as you all know, that has been submitted by 3 historic groups for potential designation of the historic district. And I want to emphasize something that we probably won't touch on a whole lot as part of the presentation, and that's just the extensive number of stakeholders that are involved in this district. Unlike one that maybe would be for a residential district, this is the people's property. And so we've done outreach to get feedback from the public at large, but also it serves the area, the civic area serves as much more than just a park. It's also a floodway. It's also consisting of buildings. It's consisting of transportation elements, these. And so we've been in robust conversations with those various departments and department leaders as well as part of the overall process. Not coming to any of those boards that was reserved for you all alone, recognizing your special relationship with parks, but did want to give you that context. And then Marcy will speak to the larger context of consideration for districts. So thank you so much for inviting us here this evening.
Wonderful. Thank you for having us back this evening. It wasn't that long ago in December when I saw you. So let's make sure I can advance the slides. I cannot. Not without
There
my
you go.
notes. Okay.
Do you want a piece of paper under that? Might help, or
Oh,
does it
thank
work
you.
on the
Thanks so
page?
much.
Very good.
I think it's whatever it is. Okay. All right. Thank you for having me back here tonight. Starting with the purpose of this meeting, it's an opportunity for you all to provide comments on the proposed designation and any significant features or alterations within the park that would go into the designation ordinance and then the design guidelines if designated. And then, of course, we'll start with an overview of the proposed civic area historic district. As we talked about in December, the different boards have different roles. And while the Parks and Rec Advisory Board doesn't have a formal role on historic district designation, because you make recommendations to City Council regarding the protection and maintenance of parks land, and this proposed district includes a park, it's appropriate for us to come and give you all an opportunity to weigh in. Your feedback will be included in the Landmarks Board, Planning Board, and City Council memos. And we're proposing that it be captured in a written summary and shared with our colleagues in parks to ensure that everything is captured accurately. We're open to other venues if you have a preferred alternative, but the Landmarks Board packet is planning to go out in about a week. And so a quick turnaround will be important. We've offered a couple of questions to help frame your discussion. You're welcome to use these or speak more broadly. The first one is, do you all have comments on the proposed designation? And would you all like to provide comments on features that should be recognized in the ordinance or the design guidelines? Going back to the beginning of this application, it can be traced back to 2021 when there was a request to expand the landmark boundary for the band shell. And the Landmarks Board voted to initiate that process and then later recommended to council that council expand the boundary. At the City Council hearing, they didn't vote to expand the boundary, but instead gave a nod of 5 to Parks and Planning and Development Services staff to explore the creation of a district in this area. And then at the beginning of last year, we determined an approach to explore a historic district, including the creation of a cultural landscape assessment. In May of 2023, 3 community groups submitted application for historic district designation, and that launched a code required process. The Landmarks Board voted to initiate that process in July, and we signed an agreement with the applicants to provide a little bit more time. In August, we began the research and department coordination. The process provides an opportunity to tell a more complete history of the area and also provide time to coordinate with the 9 different city departments, 3 ditch companies, and CDOT. In September, October, and into November, we had our community engagement focus, which included walking tours, a story map, events like What's Up Boulder, and online engagement, which is still live. Now people can go on the website and provide comments. And then in December, we formed a technical advisory group to create a draft design guideline framework, which you all, along with the Landmarks Board members, provided comments on at your December 18th joint study session. Since then, we've had another check-in across the departments. And then that brings us to now, which is the very beginning of the board and city council review. After you all weigh in, we'll then go to the Landmarks Board for their recommendation February 7th, then the Planning Board February 20th, and then City Council in March and mid-April. So getting to some questions I heard last time and starting to hear today as well is, well, what does this mean? What would designation mean? And so local designation recognizes and protects areas significant to Boulder's history. There are 10 historic districts currently designated at the local level, and 4 of those include parkland. That's Chautauqua, that's a pretty obvious one. The Pearl Street Mall is part of the Downtown Historic District. The Campbell-Robertson Park is in Mapleton Hill, and the Fortune Park is in the West Pearl Historic District. And then 7 of the 215 individual landmarks are managed by BPR. And those are covered in the Historic Places Plan to help manage those assets. And then the Penfield Tate 2 Municipal Building, where we are now, includes a stretch of the Boulder Creek Path. The benefits and responsibilities of local designation, the benefits include eligibility for tax credits, grant funding, possible code variances, staff assistance through the process, and a bronze plaque, or in the case of a district, street signage. The responsibilities are that physical changes are reviewed by the Historic Preservation Program to ensure that they're compatible with the site's historic character and the intent of the designation. And in 2023, looking at the last year, we had about 200 landmark alteration certificate applications. 88% of those were approved, 11% are still in review, and only 1% were denied. And of the approved LAC applications, 90% were approved within 2 weeks. I should note that in the rare case where an LAC is denied by the Landmarks Board, that decision is subject to call up by the City Council. Typically, we can find a compromise, or we can find a solution within the regular process, but there is kind of a checks and balances in the case that we cannot. So then turning to the application in front of us this evening, this is the map of the district boundary proposed by the applicants, extending from the west side of the municipal building to 14th Street and then Canyon down to Arapahoe, including Central Park and the 5 individually landmark structures within that area. Moving to and I'll go through the history as we go through the criteria. So the criteria for review, we have the language in the Boulder Revised Code. We're guided by the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. And then the Landmarks Board adopted local significance criteria for historic districts in 1975. As Mark mentioned, we don't have criteria specific to integrity or determining boundaries in our adopted code or regulations, but as a certified local government, we look to the National Park Service for guidance. So going to the Boulder Revised Code, the section 911.1 asks whether the proposed designation will preserve, protect, and enhance historically significant buildings and sites or architectural styles of the past, and will the designation develop and maintain appropriate settings to enhance property values, stabilize neighborhoods, promote tourist trade and interests, and foster knowledge of the city's living history. City Council will weigh whether the designation is in balance with the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. There are a handful of policies that relate directly to this designation. One is the leadership and preservation for city-owned resources. Another is the role of arts, culture, historic, and parks and recreation amenities. And then there's another one about the role of the central area. As we go into the designation criteria for local significance, and forgive me if I may need to unshare my slides with this one. We have the photos I can share in a bit, but I also need my notes. Oops, let me transition here. I'll go through the local designation criteria, which asks us to look at an area's historic, architectural, and environmental significance. So the area meets the criteria for historic significance for the public function of the area as a symbolic, political, and municipal center of Boulder's local government, and as the site of numerous social, cultural, and political events, and for its significance in the history of Boulder's park system development, as well as for the contribution of the social and cultural life of the city for over a century. The use of the park reflects the community over time. Following the construction of the bandshell in 1938, Central Park became a focal point for social activities, typically based around music, educational, or religious activities. During the 50s and early 60s, the event became more nostalgic, with memorials to pioneers, Huck Finn days, and sing-alongs. And in the 1960s and 70s, the area was the site of rallies, protests, and experimental theater. Under the criteria for recognition by authorities, the district includes 5 local landmarks, and the bandshell and tea house are potentially eligible for listing on the National Register, while the atrium and the Muni building are potentially eligible for listing on the state register. Central Park was identified in the Greenways Plan, which was most recently updated in 2011, as potentially eligible for listing in the state and national registers as part of a historic district. The area meets the criteria for architectural significance, as it includes multiple significant works by notable architects, landscape designers, builders, and urban planners, including James Hunter, Glenn Huntington, Hobart Wagner, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., and Sako de Boer. It has a unique architectural identity representing a progression of styles that provides an eclectic municipal character unique to Boulder's history, location, and climate. And the area also meets the criteria for environmental significance for its planned and natural site characteristics, including but not limited to the spatial relationship of the civic areas in Central Park, the civic buildings in Central Park, Boulder Creek and the Boulder Slough, the circulation paths with the park creating a relatively flat central green, mature trees planted in groves and lining the perimeter of the park, and the views towards the Flatirons. The area is an established visual and prominent feature of the community due to its location near major thoroughfares. As Mark mentioned, integrity is critical in terms of historic preservation, and that's the ability of a place to convey its historic significance. We look to the 7 aspects of integrity, which are location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. So PNDS staff agree with the CLA findings that the 1923 to 1937 period does not retain its physical historic integrity. The design of the park was substantially changed with the introduction of the bandshell in 1938 and its seating in 1950, which interrupted the distinct circulation pattern of diagonal walks that form a central green. Little remains in terms of the material and workmanship from that period. The Art Deco bandshell has significantly altered the feeling of Central Park, as it is a prominent feature both visible within the park and from the surrounding area. Overall, the park today does not retain the physical features to convey the integrity of association with the Olmsted brothers. However, we do consider the area retains its integrity from the 1938 to 1974 period of development. The location of Central Park and the 5 landmark structures have not moved since their establishment. The setting of an urban park surrounded by unique municipal buildings retains its historic character. Located at the prominent intersections of Broadway, Canyon, 13th, and Arapahoe, The area is centrally located and a familiar visual feature within the community. The spatial relationship between the park and surrounding buildings retain a high degree of integrity of design. Defining design characteristics include the urban street grid, a park with its central green and tree plantings around the perimeter of the park, as well as in groves, Boulder Creek and the Boulder Slough, 5 architecturally distinct structures in and adjacent to the park, many of which were designed in relation to their park setting. The workmanship is evident in the integration of art and architecture in the Duchambe Tea House, the high quality of masonry in the construction of the atrium building and the Muni building, and the construction of the bandshell and its seating. And then the district also retains its integrity of materials and its feeling as a historic urban park surrounded by 5 unique structures representing distinctive architectural styles and periods. And overall, the district retains historic integrity to convey its association with that 1937 to 1974 period and its association with the numerous social, cultural, and political activities that occurred within the park and in the surrounding public spaces. So overall, staff considers that the changes to the park and public spaces, including the introduction of the Boulder Creek path and the realignment of paths within Central Park, don't detract from the overall setting and feeling associated with the district's historic significance. I'm gonna go ahead and share my slides again here. Oops. Okay. Okay, so the final piece of our analysis looks at what is an appropriate boundary. The National Park Service bulletin provides guidance in terms of, are there visual barriers? What's the significant concentration of contributing sites or features? And are there visual changes? So our recommendation is a boundary as shown on the screen, which extends from west of the municipal building to the edge of the landmark boundaries to the east, and then from Canyon down to Arapahoe, including Central Park and the 5 structures within, as well as the full extent of 13th Street between those two, between Canyon and Broadway. Our analysis is that it contains the significant concentration of contributing buildings and sites. It utilizes Canyon and Arapahoe as visual barriers, and it follows the rear of the existing boundaries, recognizing the decline in concentration of the contributing resources. The parking lot themselves aren't historic and shouldn't be included as a buffer. And then the southern boundary follows the midline of Boulder Creek, which is a contributing feature and a visual barrier. So with that, to summarize, the proposed area meets the local criteria for designation based on its architectural, historic, and environmental significance. The area retains its historic integrity from the 1938 to 1974 period of development, and the recommended boundary encompasses a significant concentration of contributing features and uses the street grid and Boulder Creek as visual and physical barriers. And the designation ordinance and design guidelines will address contributing and non-contributing features. You can have both within a district, and those would be outlined as we get further down in the process. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have and then pull up the questions that you can use for the framework of your discussion, or you're welcome to provide broader feedback.
Well, the question, that would be helpful, please.
Great.
Okay, for this discussion, we'll start with our online members first. Do we have Sunny yet? Nope. Okay, so it'll be just Jason first, if you have a question.
No real question on this, just kind of my previous question, which happy to defer to when we're going to have kind of a conversation about overall process. So you let me know, Chuck.
I think this is that time, so.
Okay. Well, yeah. Well, first of all, I didn't mean to jump ahead with that question.
Oh, no
Mark.
problem.
I did appreciate your presentation. I learned a lot from that, and I didn't mean to kind of jump to the actual discussion on the impact. So appreciate that, and I hope that anyway, I didn't mean to jump right ahead on that. But yeah, just the question I had previously, which is, in looking through the packet, I think it was on page 15 or 16. It talks about any changes to the site would need the approval of various. I think it says landmark or historic preservation programs, and then further on in the packet, it talks about how 90% of these are relatively quick approval processes, and it's not that time consuming of a process. But I more just have a question, as this is kind of moving, and then we're also moving forward with the Civic Center, rethinking of the Civic Center Phase 2. How does this interact, and will it limit kind of what we can do with the Civic Center, the second phase of it, or is this just, as it says, just another kind of a small step that's a relatively quick step in the process? So I guess kind of big open-ended question, but that's my, question / concern about this designation.
Thank you. And why don't I go ahead and offer an answer, and then Ali or Mark, if you want to add to it, please do. So yes, the statistics show, for regular projects, and those do include larger things in the residential realm of additions or changes, it is a relatively quick process, which I think surprises people. And we've done a lot of work to streamline and clarify our process, and also help set expectations about what do the design guidelines say. And so I think applicants are very informed in coming with proposals that have a higher chance of getting approved. So I think that's a change that we've seen more recently. The Civic Area Phase 2 is a large scale project with a great team shepherding it through. And so the design review process depends on the scale of changes. Regular maintenance things, if they require review, are handled at the staff level. The vast majority of applications are reviewed at this weekly design review committee level. Something larger, like a park redevelopment, would likely be reviewed by the Landmarks Board. And so that would add somewhere between, I think, 3 to 6 months in terms of the review process. The board meets monthly, but there's the preparation before and then afterwards. So it does add time to the process, and it also provides the guidance or the review through a historic preservation lens to say, are these changes compatible with the historic character of the area, in reviewing the landmark alteration certificate. Anything to add there?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that was a really nice summary, but I will just give a few examples because I think they take a topic that most of us don't talk about every day and make it a little more relatable. So Marcy mentioned earlier that Chautauqua Park is part of a historic district. And so recently that playground opened in 2021. It required a landmark alteration certificate. Now, when folks designed Chautauqua in the late 1800s, there was a playground there, but it didn't look like the one we have today. It didn't have that, incredible handmade flat iron rock, but that all went through the LAC and was approved because it was done in a way that complemented the historic district. It is a modern playground. It's lovely. It's one of my favorite spots. That change was easily facilitated. And I think, what we hear in a lot of these questions is that, will a district stop incredible things happening in the park? I don't have that concern for a lot of reasons, one of which is this is a community park with a lot of interests and stakeholders. Just the list of boards engaged alone is a page in the Civic Area Plan. The Landmarks Board already would be consulted on this project because of the historic nature in the park. We're going to be we're going to be balancing a lot of competing interests in the park. And let's just say, that again, the fear I hear in these questions is we're not going to be able to do something that the community wants to have happen. Let's say something does go through. I always want to give an example, but then it doesn't help. But so, if someone wanted to put a Space Needle in the middle of Central Park, and there was incredible community support for that, and it wasn't in a floodplain, and the Landmarks Board said, that's not really going to fly with historic different guidelines, City Council can call it up. So it's not, it is not a, that what probably isn't a helpful example, but I think it's just sometimes, you know, you have to go really extreme to explain, like there is the possibility of if for some reason there was something that the landmarks board thought didn't align, you know, I would hope that we're working through all of these competing interests with stakeholders, but let's just say that happened. There is the call up possibility.
I didn't get a chance earlier to introduce or reintroduce Christopher Johnson. KJ is the planning manager for the comprehensive planning division within our department, and he's listening and also available to answer questions. And he did indicate he'd like to say a few things if he's available. Rosa, I know he was looking to get access. Okay. So we'll see if
Thank you, Brad. Are you able to hear me?
there's his voice.
Speaking from on high. Thank you, Brad, and thanks for that question. I did also just want to offer, I think, a little bit of context as well in terms of if the area were to be designated, and if obviously the sort of large scale repositioning and redevelopment that will ultimately come out of the civic area phase 2 process. The Landmarks Board and other PNDS and historic preservation staff are going to be part of and really integrated into that process. And so we would be able to, I think, as that process moves along and as the design is being developed, we'd be able to have updates and conversations with the Landmarks Board. So by the time a proposal or a landscape alteration certificate that would be applied for in relation to that construction, by the time that would come forward, I think there'd be the opportunity that the Landmarks Board would already be very well informed, and it wouldn't be anything new to them necessarily. So I think the timing of their review and the timing of ultimately what we would hope would be an approval through that process, we'd be able to navigate that, I think, fairly quickly as part of that review, just because we'd be able to have and have the opportunity to really prepare them for that conversation before we ever got to the meeting.
Thanks, Christopher. And I'm going to add just something myself, which is Marcy alluded to the design guidelines, which are developed in conjunction with potential designation. Excuse me. And those can sometimes be done beforehand, often are done afterwards. In this case, we know that it's very important to have a sense of what those guidelines would be. And so there are some basic guiding principles that we're working with Parks Department, but others as well, to have as part of Landmark Board's consideration. So they have a sense of where that is aiming towards. And the design guidelines are really elemental to this question of change, because it will speak to what elements can and cannot be changed and to what degree. So there'll be ongoing participation opportunities as part of that too. And I'll turn to Marcy just to make sure I haven't said anything technically incorrect.
No, only
Okay.
that you all saw the draft design guidelines framework last month at the joint study session, and that the intent is to say, here's the direction of design guidelines if the district is to be designated.
Thank you. I had 2 questions. One is in the whole packet, I didn't see any mention to the parking structures portion. So I was just wondering, what is the justification for their inclusion if they haven't been mentioned at all?
Along 14th Street.
Yeah.
Yes. So our staff recommendation is that the boundary not include those parking lots because they're not historic. And so we could be more explicit in the memo in saying that. I think it's included in the boundary justification that talk about anything from the historic period that was there is no longer there. And then the parking lot themselves are not historic, which is why we're recommending they be excluded.
Okay. And then in terms of the atrium, I didn't really see a lot of justification in there. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more about what is kind of special or historically significant, aside from that it's built in the period that they determined had historical significance.
Fair question. That 1969 rustic modern building was designed by Hobart Wagner as the Midland Savings and Loan. It's one of Wagner's best works in Boulder and is part of that modernist movement in the post-war era. It was individually designated as a landmark in 2020, and its designation ordinance, because council was also thinking about redevelopment of the East Bookend, that ordinance talks about its contributing character defining features are its pyramidal hipped roof, the use of horizontal stone, the masonry is significant, and the ordinance itself talks about adaptive reuse of that building to ensure that it could be carried forward in a creative way while still protecting those key elements. So.
Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation. Ali, I have a question for you. What do you love about this park?
What do I love about Central Park? Probably the creek and the connection and proximity to downtown. And honestly, it's potential. When we look at the civic area as a whole and the phase one renovations, and we see what they've done for activation on that side, the pandemic has completely disrupted that. I have to be clear, but if you were in that park a lot in 2018 and 19 when it first reopened, and we had staff capacity for planning community events and positive activity, you saw the promise of what this northern portion or eastern portion of the park can bring. So that's probably what I'm most excited about right now is this project. The park is not functioning well right now. And so I hesitated there because it's hard. The farmer's market is something I love in this area, and I'm so excited to keep it downtown with this project.
Thanks. Okay, that was a very philosophical question. I have a couple more direct questions. And I did a bad job of asking this at our last meeting, but if this is a park, we are mowing the grass, we're taking care of the bandshell. If it becomes designated historic district, I imagine that we still do all those same things, right? Does anything change operationally with the park?
Operationally, not that I can think of right now. Already the area that is most, so and we're talking just Central Park, the area that is most maintenance heavy is the area around the band shell. That's already landmarked. And so if we want to make changes, we already go through an LAC in that area, the landmark alteration certificate. To Brad's point earlier, the design guidelines will inform to what extent, but I don't predict right now based on what I know, based on the significant amount of research for this project and engagement. Operationally, I don't see it making impacts.
Are there any budgetary implications for this designation?
That I can predict right now, no, other than the potential positive ones for historic funding that might be available.
Okay, this is my last question. We all know that there's a lot of unhoused people who live in this park sometimes. Does this designation impact the way that those people are treated? Does it impact our ability to provide services to those people? Does it in any way address the unhoused population who are using this park more than anybody else right now?
I can't think of anything. I'm looking to my colleagues, but I can't think of a way designation would impact that.
Either. Maybe just stretching back to an analogy, if we had a designated property, a single building that was somewhat abandoned and it had been, had unhoused folks in it. I don't know that from a legal or operational standpoint, we would treat that any differently. Can you think of any examples here or just in the broader preservation community?
Yeah, broadly, designation doesn't impact the use of a park, but there are the physical components of a use, right? So adding benches or restrooms or fencing or lighting, that would go through the LAC process, but how people are treated or how it's used, there's not a connection between designation and the use in that way.
Did we answer your question? Want to be sure. Okay, thanks.
Those were really interesting questions, Bernie. And I guess I want to respond to Ali's response to one of your questions about potential costs. I can think of an additional cost, and that is in delay of moving forward in renovation plans. It could significantly impact the budget and cause an increase in costs there.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
I want to connect with what KJ was talking about and what I mentioned about the Landmarks Board being a stakeholder in the civic area park planning effort. In theory, we're bringing them along and they're part of the design process so that if there are proposed changes that require their approval, they've been a part of that development and it's an easy unanimous yes, because they see how it connects with the historic area of the park and advances the civic area plan and the community input we've received. So I think that's our best hope. And I welcome KJ, Brad, or Marcy to chime in. You can see how much we're all working together on this because it is an intertwining of disciplines and expertise here.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Ally, for being able to weigh in too. I would even go further than saying a hope and really an expectation. You know, we work together as departments and one city on many, many things. And it's our intention to not be surprising one another or not working in tandem. We have the unique ability and responsibility when the city is the owner to work closely in those areas. So just an example that pops in my mind from today, council has had a conversation about sanctioned camping areas, safe outdoor spaces, and questions about permitting and those types of things and the interplay between that. And we know that that's something that we have a ability and obligation to be in the conversation right up front. Whereas when an individual developer is developing something, they are developing it and then saying, okay, here's what we're proposing. As city partners, we're able to come along throughout that process. So I would go beyond hope, not to disagree with you, and just say that's our expectation.
Thanks. It was a lot of interesting reading, and I took some notes. So I'm going to refer to them as I go along. I wanted to start by thanking the staff for their in-depth analysis, and I really enjoyed the story map. I spent like an hour and a half just poking around that thing and reading about how the site had evolved from indigenous peoples through the early settlers and the houses of ill repute and different people who lived there and what they did and what we don't know about them, as well as what we did know about them. It's really fascinating and a nice job. And then it was interesting to read about the band shell construction and the Olmsted Jr.'s role in designing his overall vision for the area. Then the social activism of the 60s and 70s and the addition of the Dushanbe Tea House and what happens today with the farmers market. And so when I look at this park, I don't see a static place. I see a place that's changed with time repeatedly, and it's evolved constantly in response to the societal needs of the city. As the city has evolved, the park has evolved along with it. Remember the railroad display that was put up, right? And that was there for several decades, and then it was vandalized and repaired, and then it was ultimately sent to Golden and disappeared. And things have always been changing. And I would say that actually change is just about the defining feature of the park. It's never been static. And there are already 5 buildings that are near the park that have protected status. There's the municipal building, the atrium building, the tea house, the storage and transfer building, which is now the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art, and then the band shell. And we've already heard that the land itself, the park that's away from the band shell, doesn't have a clear relationship to Olmsted Jr. anymore. The continuity has been lost. I don't see, you mentioned today that there was a relationship between these different buildings and the park space. And I don't really see that relationship. I see disparate buildings that were built in different eras that happen to be placed on the street near the park. Certainly the municipal building is placed there for a reason because it's the civic heart of the city, right? So that makes sense. But I don't see how these groupings form a historic district in themselves. They seem to be fairly random and disconnected. The park itself is in the early stages of the civic era phase 2 process. And I'm concerned that the part of the intent of this application might be actually to derail or slow or to gain some control over this process. And I don't, that may just be my suspicion, but I don't like where that's heading. And I think that this park needs to be able to adapt and respond to both the current and future needs of the city. It's not operating as a park very well right now, as we've heard, and it needs major changes. And I think that a historic district designation is really not appropriate for this type of part of the city. It's the civic heart of the city. It needs to evolve. It needs to change. It needs to adapt to the needs of the city's residents. So I'm not really in favor of this proposal. I think that the cultural landscape assessment showed the section around the band shell is appropriate for designation, and I would be supportive of that. But I don't see how the rest of the park, I don't see the benefits of the historic district, and I see many downsides from the point of view of being able to quickly make changes when they're needed.
I just had one more question in terms when related to Bernie's question about the costs. When the list of the benefits included a bunch of different tax credits, but it referred to income generating fixtures or areas. So I was wondering if there's any tax benefits to parks of the historic designation.
Yeah, the tax credits both at the state and federal level are for residential properties or income producing properties. So it would be the grant eligibility that would be more relevant to this historic district for the park and for the surrounding buildings. And the grants that are provided by the State Historic Fund have to show a public benefit. And so those grants are not available to many of the private property owners in town other than the Hannah Barker House. I think they got a big grant, but it would be more in the grant funding eligibility rather than the tax credits, which is income tax credit.
Could you speak to any more benefits that would result from having this being a historic district designation?
Oh, sure. I think what's in the memo that I didn't touch on in my presentation is the economic benefit of historic preservation that we see here in Boulder through tourism and also through the economy. The 9 places, most popular places in Boulder, 7 of those are historic places in and around historic places. The 8th one is Celestial Seasonings, and the 9th one is the Boulder County Farmers Market, but the other ones, Chautauqua, Pearl Street, the Tea House. So many of these are in and around historic places, and that is because it creates a sense of place, and it's a place that people are drawn to and want to come to. So there's the tangible benefits of historic preservation, and then the intangible in terms of how a community changes over time. And I would agree with your earlier comment of these places can be very dynamic, even when they're very old.
And I'll just add on to that, we certainly respect and will welcome whatever the group comments are from the board. And as we said at the beginning, our task here is to bring that then to the landmarks board. So I offer this up just in the spirit of not trying to change minds or anything, but just recognizing that when we speak of the design guidelines, a theme of those guidelines can be its history of change. And we've had preliminary discussion around that. And even some of that is, and again, I'm going to ask Marcy to keep me honest, but some of that is articulated in the guidelines. And we would expect that could very well, or I'm sorry, in the, what's the term we're using?
The guiding principles.
The guiding principles for the guidelines. And we would expect that conversation to continue. I don't know if you want to elaborate on kind of the preliminary discussion about those.
No, it is a theme that emerged, which is what does bring this area together. And it is that there are these very distinct periods of time. It's not that the bandshell was designed in the Art Deco style and then everything that came after it was a replica of the Art Deco style. It's the Muni building is different. The tea house is different. And so that if designated, the guidelines could carry that spirit forward. But I also agree with what Brad said, is that our job as the case managers is to bring the information forward to the decision makers, in this case, City Council, for them to make an informed decision. So we welcome all of your perspectives, and I won't try and convince you one way or the other. We've done our staff analysis based on that criteria, but we're just collecting the information to then have council make a decision. So thank you for your thoughtfulness in preparation.
I will want to add one more contextual item too, and that's I alluded at the beginning to the conversations we've had with other stakeholders. And again, those are other interests in the civic area, such as facilities and stormwater with flood control. They too have asked questions about change. What happens if we need to manage flood control differently over time? What if we need to repurpose the buildings? What if the buildings get sold or torn down? So these are questions that are all part of this larger context of potential change. And I would submit what makes a historic district for a park, and really not just a park, but a civic area, a much more different animal than probably anything that we do have in the city's history. Even Chautauqua is primarily identified as a park. Although with housing, I guess, as I reflect on that, but we've recognized the uniqueness of that and the role of potential change in other conversations as well.
Okay, I'll make one more quick pass to the board to see if there are any further comments. So Jason, do you have anything?
Sorry, couldn't find my mute. No, nothing else for me. Thanks. Great questions though.
Thank you.
I asked Allie her favorite thing about the park, and I just want to take a moment to say my least favorite thing about this park, which is that it's bounded west and north by two very busy state highways that make it an unpleasant place. Sorry, make it not as pleasant a place as it could be. And I think that's obviously a reality that we are stuck with, and it's too bad.
Well, thank you very much for the presentations, and look forward to seeing the report to the Landmarks Board and to City Council.
And thank you. And just confirming, is it an okay approach with you all for us to prepare a written summary, share it with our colleagues in Parks, and include that in the Landmarks Board packet? Or is there another format that you would prefer? Or would you like to see that?
Yeah, I was going to chime in to make sure we close this out in a way that we're in alignment. When Chuck and Elliot and I spoke about the timeline for this, there is not the time for you a written summary to come back to you all to review and approve. And so I would suggest that with the great brains we have in the room, we spend just a few minutes to align around what we think we heard were themes that we would report back to the Landmarks Board, and then we can do the wording to include that in the memo if that works for you all. I can share. I heard two things. One is there are concerns around how it will impact change, and then second, there are concerns about how it would impact funding.
And just to elaborate on that, and again, we appreciate your understanding of the code determined tight timeline this represents. And honestly, but for the tolling agreement, I don't know how we would have done it. So we're grateful for that. Just in terms of that and recognizing that, is there the opportunity or the forum to just send an email version of that to the board members and then give them a day or two, or do we not have that ability?
Because of the sunshine laws, there's no way to do that. You would have, I mean, you could do it individually, but it is pretty problematic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess I'm hearing that we will just do our earnest best collectively to make sure we've represented all the comments that we've heard this evening.
I'm satisfied with that. Are there any comments from the board?
I do wonder if we should put a finer point on it, just state our individual positions on whether or not we think this should go forward.
Okay,
And I'll go first. I'm willing.
please.
I agree with what Chuck said earlier. I'm concerned that designating this area historic district will unduly constrain future development, and I would not recommend the city council go forward with the designation.
Jason?
Yeah, I share the same concerns that Bernie just shared as and what you shared as well, Chuck. I think, as you said, the buildings are already designated historic. I do have very similar concerns as to the necessity of designating the whole area historic, and the impact, on future plans. So I would also, yeah, recommend against it as well.
Thank you. Anna?
I would also be on the side of recommending against it. I don't see kind of an overarching theme to the different elements except for geographic proximity. And the potential benefits, I don't see outweighing the potential challenges that it could bring.
And I'm in agreement with all those statements.
I think I speak for everybody, but correct me if not, that we believe this park can be better than it is, and we would like to see that. And we don't want a historic designation to stand in the way of this park improving.
Or even to slow it down. Yeah. Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Really appreciate the presentations.
Yeah, I want to thank the teams that came. I want to thank Brad and Marcy they have plenty of evening meetings and have added one. And I also want to thank you all. It's clear that you reviewed all of this carefully. You understand this is an important land use conversation. We just appreciate you diving in on an unfamiliar topic. So thank you. To support our transition, I'm going to just start introducing this next. Oh, did you have something you want to say in closing?
No,
Sorry,
just-
buddy.
Just further thanks and recognizing that there's a broader team that's worked on this, including some of our additional staff in planning and development services. So thank you again.
Thank you. So I think what we have next is going to be the court system plan, and Ally's going to.
That is
Create
correct. While
some
these
time.
folks get organized, I'll introduce them. So we've got senior landscape architect Tina Briggs and city planner Charlotte O'Donnell coming up to the dais to present this item. I'll note that this is a project where we've had a board liaison. That's been Bernie over here, and I'm very excited. We've got our first very high level round of findings and recommendations. We know this project has been very much wanted by many in our community, and the work that they're coming up with and that we're about to review with you all is really exciting because we've got some solutions.
Awesome. Thanks for having us. I think Rosa's going to go ahead and share slides. Is that all right? Thanks, Rosa. And thanks for that introduction, Ally. As she said, I'm Charlotte O'Donnell. I'm a city planner, but I know some of you well from my time working with Brad. And I'm going to kick us off with this presentation. As Rosa gets it up, it's really to hit the highlights. The memo went into a bunch more detail, but happy to answer questions and go into more of that detail at the end, as all requested. So Rosa, if you go to the next slide, this is just to say we're here to provide updates on the progress that we've made on this project. We're really excited. If you go to the next slide, Rosa. Could you go to the next slide, Rosa? Okay. Oh, I know switching between screens sometimes gets you. But the agenda follows the memo itself. So we're going to talk a little bit about the background, remind you what we talked to you in May and November about, some best practices, a draft level of service, which really means how many courts we're planning to have in Boulder, and site analysis, where those courts could potentially go, and then how we'll get there, the action plan and funding behind it. So next slide. And so as part of the background, before we really dive in, you've seen this graphic before from us, but part of the reason that we're doing this plan is coming from direction from the 2022 BPR master plan or department plan. So we're looking not only at the fiscally constrained, but the action and vision levels of what courts could be in our community. So next slide. These are tiny cutouts of the slides you saw from us before in May and November, where we talked about our current supply, the changing supply within the community with private courts going away in several cases in the next couple of years, how these sports are growing, how the conditions of the courts are due to the maintenance backlog, backlog and how this fits in with all the multiple priorities that our department has. So quick reminder of the slides you've seen. And then next slide. And here's this timeline graphic for us again that you saw last time with us, but we're really in the middle of the process, as you can see from that big yellow arrow. But if we look across the top, those black arrows at the top, you can see now we're moving from analysis and evaluation into concepts, which is to say into drawing, again, what additional courts would look like at actual sites within our system. And then later we'll be coming back to you with more information on the operations, the programming, the funding, and all the things that make those physical sites work. But tonight we're really focused on those physical aspects. So Rosa, next slide. So next slide again. The best practices and market comparison that we're bringing tonight then are focused around those physical pieces. So you've heard us talk a lot about reinforced concrete, maybe too much, but it's really important to us because it improves the playability of the courts for the life and the lifespan of those courts, while at the same time reducing maintenance cost over its lifespan. So it's a huge win for our community as well as efficiency for our team. That's something, again, that was previously identified by staff and we're continuing to move forward. Another emerging best practice is dedicated and grouped courts. So we recognize that we've had multi-use courts to serve pickleball as was an emerging need in our community, but the industry is now recommending to have dedicated courts to best serve both the different needs of both of those different sports, as well as grouped courts, which allows them to carry out programming like drop-in, like leagues, and the social nature of the sport. And then developing a per capita level of service for how many courts we want to serve the population that we have is also a best practice. And we're going to dive into that in a little bit. So Rose, if you go to the next slide. Before we dive into the level of service itself, one of the data points we wanted to provide that helps us develop our level of service, but is not the end all be all in terms of level of service, is benchmarking against other communities. So this table is in your memo again, so you can look at it in more detail. The top portion of this table is regional comparisons, and the bottom is other peer agencies nationally that we use as comparisons. So these are the same cities we use in a lot of our planning efforts. You'll notice these are the same cities we compared against in our master plan, for instance, based on demographics, population, and other factors that make them similar to Boulder. But one of the important things, there's a lot of questions on this slide. I'll go a little bit more and then I can take questions on the slide if you want. One of the important things on the slide, right, is we see a lot of variation, and we also know it's not telling us the whole picture of what's happening. So for instance, in South Suburban, if we look at tennis, there's only one court per one municipal court or one public agency court per 25,000 people. But we know that's an area that actually nationwide is a leader in terms of private clubs, HOAs, and other courts within the community. So it has a large breadth of tennis services provided that's not reflected in this just municipal comparison. So you'll see in the memo as well, right? I took that out so you could see what that average would be. It's a lot closer to what Boulder's is if we remove that outcome. So do folks still have questions on the slide, or do we want to keep moving? And I can answer those questions at the end too. Chuck has a question. All right.
Yeah, sorry.
Go for it.
As long as we're here, so we don't have to come back. What happens to these numbers when you include private courts?
So we haven't fully included private courts because we're really looking at the community access of courts and looking at the courts that are free and available to the public a significant number of hours, or free or low cost. And it's a hard line to draw as well. So it's something we considered and worked with our consultant on. Should we be counting all the HOAs, put them on Google Maps and try to count everyone that has one in their backyard, right? But it becomes a pretty complex calculation in terms of where to draw the lines. So that's, at least in this benchmarking table that you see, that's where why we haven't included those courts.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Feel free to jump in. Anna, did you have a question on this benchmarking as well before we move on, or?
No, I just couldn't see because of Jason Unger's
Oh.
thing. So then I looked
Yes.
on the packet and I was able to see what
Perfect,
was
perfect.
covered.
All right, so moving on from benchmarking, if you go to the next slide, and then one more, Rosa. So benchmarking is just one piece of what we looked at in developing this level of service, per capita level of service for how many courts our community we should provide to our community. We also looked at industry standards. In our case, there's not an out of the box. If you have this many people in your community, you should have this many tennis courts and this many pickleball. That doesn't exist in this case. But we did talk with both USTA and USA Pickleball and got their input on what seems appropriate. We also factored in the growth of these sports and anticipated growth of these sports. We know they both have grown in the last several years, and especially pickleball goes notably extremely fast. We factored in the estimated current number of people in the Boulder population that play tennis. Both these numbers are higher than the national average. Again, details in the packet, but they're about 2 to 3% higher, percentage-wise, people playing tennis and pickleball here in Boulder than they are nationally. We looked at historically our level of service that we have provided the community before we started multi-striping, how many courts were available to the community for tennis. And then we also, as I talked about, Chuck a little bit touched on, we talked about what the city's contribution level and what the city's role is in terms of providing courts. So not just that number, but really focusing on the community access piece of it. And so Rosa, if you'd go to the next slide. And the memo had some more details on, I'm one slide ahead of myself. Okay, so go ahead. You're good, Rosa. I switched the order on myself. Okay. So this, in conclusion, what this leads us to is that our goal for BPR is to add 22 dedicated pickleball courts and to add 22 dedicated tennis courts to the existing stock of 20 there for a total of 42. And it's a bit funny that those numbers match, to acknowledge that. It was interesting that as we looked at different options with a consultant of how to calculate, we hovered around 21, 22 for both sports. So it's interesting that the math, we did do math and it worked out that way. And with this, we're also looking to retain the multi-use courts. So not set a defined number of how many multi-use courts to have in our community, but recognize their value that they do provide, especially in places where it might not be possible to have 4 tennis courts and 4 pickleball courts, for instance. And just commit to evaluating their use as dedicated courts are added. So now, Rosa, if you'd go to the next slide. Okay, so besides just looking at the number, as I mentioned, looking at the city's contribution level and the community access, this chart that's also in the memo, so you can look in extra detail, but the dark blue background is looking at the high priority investment areas as identified in our 2022 master plan. So looking where there's economic need or other underserved populations. And then the red that's overlaid is our current tennis court location, just for example. So you can start to see where geographic gaps may exist, where also those high investment gaps may exist as well. So just to footnote again, how we're looking at equity, youth, and accessibility, not just the pure number of courts that we're going to add. So Rosa, could you go to the next slide?
Next question on that
Yeah.
before we move on. This map, just to make sure that I'm understanding it correctly, you've taken off the pickleball courts at South Boulder Rec and Chautauqua.
Yes, so that's a great question. This map is looking just at dedicated tennis courts. That's again, we're keeping those multi-courts separate for the time being, recognizing that dedicated grouped courts is the industry standard, but that those contribute in a different way.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bernie. All right, Rosa, yeah, next one. Oh, Anna has a question too before we move on. Okay.
Could you please just explain the different side pink circle size, like what the meaning of
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, good clarification. So the size of the circle represents each court serving 1,750 courts. So in the cases where if there was just one court, it would mean that within that red circle, 1,750 people live in that red circle. And that's, if you saw in your memo, that's how we got to 22 courts for each sport being added, is that 1,000 to 1 court per 1,750 people.
But then if you have circles that overlap each other, how does that work? Because then you're double counting the same people.
True, yes. And this is not supposed to be like an end all be all tool. It's just giving us an idea as a start. So that could be something that we look at further as we continue to analyze this, is maybe decoupling those circles. Yeah, that's a great point. Now. All right, next slide. So in order to add those 22 courts, we looked at 6 potential sites: Foothills, Tom Watson, Valmont, Stasio, East, and South. These are our city parks, community parks, or recreational facilities where there was square footage for 4 or more additional courts, free of obvious topography challenges, free of obvious residential noise challenges that we know pickleball has. And then we scored them based on this different criteria, or consultants scored them based on this different criteria you see on the side. And the next slide will show you how these all ranked, which perhaps unsurprisingly, the top 3 are all 3 that we have upcoming plans for those parks. So East, Valmont, and Tom Watson are listed there with the years that those parks are currently part of our upcoming CIP process. And then if we're unable to accomplish those 44 additional courts at those 3 sites by 2030, we're also going to be looking at Foothills and Stasio. So those will also get drawings as part of this project in terms of what additional courts could look like at those sites in case we need additional sites to achieve that number. But South is falling off at this point. Through this analysis, we realized there's too many limitations on that site, too many competing current uses, as well as constraints in terms of wetlands and floodplain and residential proximity. So you will see 5 concept plans as part of this plan. And those are the ones in blue and green. All right, Rosa. So this is more detail in terms of how we get there and looking at those 3 sites. So starting in 2024, we are investing $400,000 every year for the next 6 years to address that backlog. And Arapahoe Ridge and Columbine are the currently identified properties for 2024 to receive that post-tension upgrade. And we hope that this will address the serious condition concerns at those parks. They're 2 of our worst condition courts, and really bring those courts back online in a way. As you can see, the picture of that lovely crack at Arapahoe Ridge, it's just one of many that we know hinders play at those locations, and hoping that that will help take pressure off our system by really adding those back to the mix. And that's just the first year of that $400,000 funding. And you'll see that it does continue through the 6-year CIP as we go through. So very excitingly in 2024, this concept plan that East Boulder Park will receive for additional courts as part of the court system plan is a kickoff for planning and design for up to 8 additional dedicated, or 8 dedicated tennis courts, not additional, 8 total tennis courts at East, and 16 dedicated pickleball courts at East up to. So that's 1.75 to 2.25 million for that whole park project with construction in 2025. And then the other thing before we move to the next slide in 2024 is to note that's really our focus, is to do the post-tension work to improve condition and to start planning at East Boulder. So we're not making any other changes to the current distribution of courts, recognizing that any changes right now would just pit the sports against each other and would potentially decrease the amount of playing opportunities for one of the sports. But if we move into 2026, so next slide, yeah, awesome. Through 2028, again, you see that $400,000 every year continue. And then we see Valmont South come online. So with planning in 2027, construction starting in 2028, 1 million to 1.5 million for up to 12 dedicated tennis courts at Valmont South, with some indoor potential that Tina will talk about in a little bit. Next slide, Rosa. And then in 2029 and 2030, that's where we see Tom Watson start to come online, up to 8 dedicated tennis courts and 4 dedicated pickleball courts there. So $1.25 to $1.7 million there for that park project. And then after 2030, again, we have 2 more properties where we could consider building. Rosa, could you go back a slide? Sorry, just I know people start to read. And we have 2 more properties where we could consider adding courts if we haven't achieved the numbers that we want to through the 2030 CIP. And then speaking of long range, I'm going to turn it over to Tina to talk about indoor. So if you go to the next slide now.
So we do know our community is interested in an indoor facility. So we are also going to pay attention to some of the potential that we have there. So part of what we're looking at is when we do this, part of this study is looking at some of the initial outcomes, right? So what is our role in that? So what is BPR's role? Is that something in a partnership development that we would be the land, we would being the capital? What would a partnership look like? And to get there, we would have to look at our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and constraints. And then we're going to put some funding to that. What does that also look like? And then when we talk about funding, there's lots to that, right? It's that capital and annual maintenance, but then it's actually the operating costs, right? And then looking at what a matrix with a partnership could look like. We know adding any type of facility right now, as you well know, you're aware of rec centers and aquatics and some other facilities that we are looking at some big dollar renovations to those facilities in the near future. So looking at also what that looks like in the future years and making sure that we have that funding set up. So once we have some of that laid out a little bit, we start to look at actually numbers and types of courts and then things that are associated. So one of the properties obviously that we're looking at for our facility is the Valmont. And in that, right, we know there's the access and circulation, which means, right, there's not driveways and parking lots right now in that facility or in that vicinity. There are prairie dogs there that would have to be moved, that sort of thing. So we really have to dig in a little bit deeper and come out then with a framework of what that would look like. And then also pay attention, not displacing other things that were potentially in that area, or looking in the future of how would those work together. So basically we're looking at the facility. We know it's in a far out future. We know there's no current funding for it, but this is going to be designed to help us develop a path to get there.
And Rosa, I see our consultant, Mike Svets, has just been able to join. Do you mind jumping to the Zoom and adding him as a panelist as we finish up the presentation? Awesome. And then if you go to the next slide. So that's what we have for you tonight, to get the highlights in terms of what we provided in the memo. So we're looking at all levels of the physical spaces, fixing the maintenance backlog, prioritizing the funding we have, planning that $400K of annual investment for maintenance, and then looking at what the needs are for additional dedicated courts and where those dedicated courts could exist before we come back to you with the drawings of what those sites could actually look like in March. So Rosa, next slide. Those 5 drawings would be part of engagement window 2, the first one having been this past October. And that will include a public meeting on March 4th. So we'll provide you more details and invitations to that. Of course, PRAB members are welcome to attend. We just set that date, so we wanted to share it with you tonight. And after that public meeting, we'll be bringing that feedback and those designs to you all at your March meeting. And then Mike, I don't know if you have anything you want to chime in with now, but if we have any questions for him as well, we can direct it there. And Rose, if you want to go to the next slide. If PRAB has any questions for us in terms of the number of additional courts or the sites where they're planned and what actions we have to get to those builds, or any questions for Tina about the indoor facility, we'd love to take anything else from you all.
Thanks very much. Let's start with Jason online.
Yeah, really appreciate the presentation and the really thoughtful approach to this, looking at equity, looking at geographic need. So really appreciate that, and good to see you here, Charlotte, even though I'm not there in person. Good to see you presenting here. I have a question on, maybe it's too early to process, but I know I was reading about the limitations at south, and so then east looks like it's the most feasible option. Where, it's again maybe too early for this, but where is there room there for 18 courts? Would that be on the, like, I mean, it's either surrounded by open space, it seems like, or residential areas, except to the south, I guess.
At east, Jason, just to
Sorry,
clarify,
at
not
east. Yeah,
south.
I meant
Okay.
east, not south. Yep, sorry about that. Thanks.
Yeah, at east. Yeah, so that's part of what we'll look at, a couple options in terms of the drawings that we bring to you in March. There's some space there between where the dog parks are and where the current courts are. There's also potential to, so there's a couple different potentials. I don't know if anybody else wants to add detail on that at this point, or
Yeah.
have more in March.
Yeah, I can jump in. So you will see mapping in March. What we're looking at right now is the potential, like some of those numbers you saw was really like the max that we would think we could provide in that area. So exactly where they go and how they're configured, we're working out. That's really the feasibility part. And that's what in, the public meeting, we'll see those, and we'll be sharing those with the stakeholder team also, and then prep. So to be determined. That's our goal. That's what we would love to see there. There may be some constraints, but that's what we're working through right now.
All right, thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Jason.
I have so many questions. We know from the pickleball community that it's very important to them to have the complex 16 courts in one location. Do we think at this point that's at all feasible? And if so, where do you think that might end up?
That's again at east, why we're hoping for that number and why we're looking to see where that could be possible on that site. Yeah.
Yep. The interesting part about the pickleball courts and the mass of 16 is theoretically right now we use 2 pickleball per tennis court because we're configuring them by multi-sport. If you just looked at square footage, if you packed them in perfectly tightly, we could fit 4 of them on a tennis court. So the land mass that we need for pickleball courts is, 2/3 versus, yeah. Okay.
So regarding indoor, the facility it's interesting, and I certainly understand why people want it, but I wonder, have we contemplated at all purchasing a bubble that we could put over some smaller quantity of courts in the colder months?
So that actually is one of the things that we're looking at as we start to get into the management and operations of them. So depending on the shape of, how they're configured and what that looks like, there is some potential for looking at what that would look like. But again, we haven't done all of the evaluations yet.
Just to chime in on that, we've previously studied bubbles for different facilities, and of course, pools and tennis courts have different needs. But this was pretty heavily considered in 2017, as in we were in final design for Scott Carpenter Pool. A bubble on its own is problematic under Boulder's code and goals for a lot of reasons. They require an HVAC system that is very, very, very energy intensive. And what you'll learn as we go through the recreation centers project, that the building envelope is where you get your efficiency, and a bubble is not an envelope. And so they're just incredibly energy inefficient. The other challenge is the ongoing operational expense to put them up and take them down every year. And so they're seen as a short-term and quick answer, but they may not be best for the long-term and for our community.
And I'll say that having spent a lot of time racing at the Velodrome in Colorado Springs, which is under a bubble, it is quite apparent the energy that goes into keeping the bubble aloft. So I do appreciate that. Thank you.
So thank you for this overview. My question I had two questions. One, since this kind of seems like a roadmap for the next 7 years, in terms of court availability and planning, I was wondering, I don't see anything about the handball, and I know that that is a sport that, many Hispanic men in Boulder community play, and so I was just wondering, like, where does that figure, and is that like a separate planning, or has there any been consultation or engagement with Hispanic community about the handball courts and needs? So that was my first question.
Yeah, so we do have handball courts currently in 2 locations, East Boulder and Tom Watson. And you'll notice those are the 2 that are on the list for park renovation. So as we're talking about the court system, really just focusing on tennis and pickleball for this particular study, we know that those 2 parks are also getting park renovations, which would include looking at how those are being used, and should they be improved, expanded, or what that looks like in that park renovation.
So it doesn't mean that there's going to be like no new handball. Like when it says 22 pickleball, 22 tennis, it doesn't mean like 0 everything else.
Correct.
Okay, got it. And then my other question was that, like, for me, having bathrooms is super, it's like a deal breaker for any like outdoor recreation. I was just wondering what bathroom plans are for these permanent facilities that you're going to be standing up.
Yeah, so East Boulder Community Park does have restrooms, and it would be located probably central to where the tennis and pickleball would be. And then in addition to that, Tom Watson, currently the restroom is closed and shut down. As we looked at that park renovation, we would look at what bringing that back online would look like as part of that park renovation budget as a whole. And I think putting a complex out there, right? If you're putting a mass of facilities like that, it's something we would have to consider within that renovation.
And then for some of the smaller, like standalone ones like Columbine, is there any plan to put like porta potties like they have at Centennial or other?
That might be another question you would take.
I know that the team is working that when we have scheduled use at a park, they are adding porta potties. The challenge with it, and so if it's just about portable restrooms, I believe that moving forward, and I'll double check with the team, if we have a site where there's scheduled use, yes, we know like Columbine has often soccer, we are requiring the groups to have a portable for that. Having a restroom in every park is not financially possible. Unfortunately, the math, the total 20-year cost of a simple park restroom is around $1 million. And so when you add in that we have about 50 sites, it's just simply not financially feasible. I agree with you, it'd be ideal. Yeah.
So Columbine will have bathrooms for the soccer now?
They're supposed to. Let me check on that and maybe report back next meeting.
That would be amazing because I
Yep.
just see like it.
I
has
think they
always-
did as of last year or a couple of years ago, but let me make sure I'm not making stuff up, and we'll
Okay.
report back in February.
Okay, thanks.
Well, this is great news. It's going to make the tennis community happy, although they're going to want it next year and not spread out over 6 years. But that's the realistic time schedule. I'm wondering, given the changes to the CIP, where are we getting the money from? What's getting lost that won't get money to pay for these?
Yeah, I'm going to have Mark come up to answer the CIP question. I do want to say we really appreciate the stakeholder group we've been working with. I think we've gotten to a great point with them, and they actually saw parts of this presentation first and helped us just with the messaging and all those questions that those that are not planners might have about our planner speak, and really appreciate them. I know some are listening in tonight as well. So appreciate all their work towards this too.
Mark Davison, Planning Manager. Thanks, Chuck. It's a great question. The asset management side of it, the 400,000 a year, as you know, we only approve 1 year ahead. Okay. You make the recommendation, council approves. It's just for 24. The rest is projections. When we wrote the CI plan to you for 23, we included the 400,000 per year. So that is already identified. The other 3 sites, the numbers you're seeing, I want to underline, and Tina pointed that out, it's up to, it all depends. And then in the memo, there's very clear caveats that those 3 parks will require community engagement, understand the needs for the parks, and there is a larger sum to cover the capital investment for those 3 sites. And the figures are pointing out what the cost is, would be to add up to that many courts. So they'll undergo an engagement process, and then we're coming up with the final outcome and the final plan, which obviously would come back to the board. And we'll be bringing more of that information to you in March and April.
I'll add just one note from a timing piece that part of the design of the timing of this project, that you all would have this information and this plan as we develop the next years of approved and then planned spending, so that it can inform further allocations.
Right. I guess we can get a 5-year projection of the CIP, and we have this nice table that says what we're going to spend where. And yeah, it'd be nice to see where this falls in there and where that money comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we come back, obviously in April, you'll see that larger picture.
No, I won't.
Good point, Chuck. That's quite sad to think about.
You're going to pull that every month now, aren't you? It's just going to be so sad.
Man, you got me right.
But thank you anyway.
The board will review it with their 5-year capital plans that we start talking about in April, and you'll have this information for that conversation. It'll be a prioritization conversation. As you all know, we do not have enough money to both take care of everything in our system and build new. And so there'll be a prioritization conversation.
Gotcha. As you know, I'm a fan of 15-minute neighborhoods, and I like having facilities that we can access by bike and walking and bus. And these sites are hard. Tom Watson specifically is especially hard to get to. East is pretty far out there too, which is why there's space to build things, right? I mean, that's part of the trade-off. Did you consider Violet Park in its new development? Because it's going to be developed, and there's probably not a lot of space there, and it's in a floodplain, and there are probably other caveats.
Yeah, it's a neighborhood park with of the 10 acres plus 1 potential acre, there's 2 acres that would allow for park development. And a neighborhood park, like North Boulder Park, the intense development, it's like 1.7 acres just to cover the picnic shelter, the play area, the gathering space. So then add another recreation activity that would be very constrained. But we are looking across the board at Violet at all recreation opportunities. Have made no decision yet. So you never know what might pop up from community needs.
Okay. And I would encourage you to look at like parking areas that are underutilized as a potential footprint for some tennis courts, at least. The other comment I had was relevant to Anna's comment about handball. Have you considered moving the handball courts to Howard Houston Park? And that would provide more space for tennis. Because many of the people who would use handball courts probably live much closer to 30th Street than they do to Far East Boulder.
Tina's going to have an answer to this, but I think that's the whole point of the thoughtful engagement. That's a pretty deep assumption. We need to talk to that community. It's heavily and regularly used, to Anna's point. When I'm out there, that community is so strong, and I love talking to those gentlemen. They have such an incredible camaraderie, but we have no clue where they live. So
yeah, it's an assumption on my part for sure.
Yeah, and what you'll notice is we actually started out looking at all of our parks, and then we kind of went down, right? And like, as we're eliminating them and looking, so there was like a whole list of criteria that we were looking at. And the reason we landed on those 6 particular properties was basically looking at that criteria and our best option. So part of that's landmass, part of it is accessibility, part of it is, could we put enough parking there, right? So if you're going to put, 8 tennis courts somewhere, you have to accommodate for the parking for those folks as well. Knowing some of them are going to drive, and hopefully multimodal will be an opportunity. So through those criteria, we really did break it down to those 6 parks. And even within those 6, you can see how some of them are prioritized based on, the topography and that sort of thing. So if that helps, we actually did look across our system and really honed it down to identify the 6 that make the most sense, or 5 it turned out.
And Rosa's pulling up that criteria as well. Thanks, Rosa. If you go back a couple more. Yeah, those numbers are wrong. If you go back about 7 slides. Other way. This is all our math, just in case you wanted to see it. Now you get to see it.
We had a lot of spreadsheets.
Other questions though?
While we're waiting to pull that up, I'll just chime in, and I did get an answer on Columbine and a porta potty. And so we do put one out there during the soccer season. And so it is between the tennis area and the fields along the Glenwood, kind of tucked up near the trees during the season, not over at the BBSD fields. So I figured I would pass that information along.
Yeah, and I think I kind of skipped over the handball courts too. So what we are looking at is when we're looking at configuring things. So one of the reasons, for example, South Boulder fell to the bottom is in order to place any kind of mass of those courts would then offset or remove some other activities. Is it a multi-use field? Is it volleyball courts? Is it, who else is it then going to impact versus some of the other parks that we still have room to put without impacting those or taking them away. And then as far as you're right, the handball, that as we do those park renovations, that absolutely will be a good question of, is this the right place, right? When you're used to going there and you're used to meeting your friends, creatures of habit, sometimes to have some into that, right? Like, where do we gather with our friends? So making it a really nice place to gather might be more important to them than the location. So those are some of the questions that we would ask during those public engagement sessions.
Okay, are there any further questions or comments from the board? Great. Next item is the 2024 action plan.
All right, Rosa is going to drive this presentation for me. The intent of this item is to give you just a brief overview of planned work. You all see our capital improvement plan, but want to remind you of just high-level timing of some of the key projects coming this year. And then also want to tell you a little bit about what is going on operationally. So we're both going to get that set. But first, the first slide here, before we talk about the special accomplishments and all the exciting work we have ahead to make our system stronger, better, faster, we just have to celebrate that. If you'll go to the next slide, the work that our team does every single day to achieve our mission. You can see here just some of the points of the people sometimes forget how robust our system is. I know you're all aware, but we have 86 sites, 42 playgrounds, 3 rec centers, 4 dog parks. So many trees and flowers. We operate the Boulder Reservoir, the Flatirons Golf Course, Valmont Bike Park, and this is not everything. And so the bulk of what our team does is operate this system. And I share that because, we all get interests from community members and things they want us to fix right now or to do differently right now. And so often we just aren't resourced in that way from a staffing capacity. And so we are always trying to prioritize what is most important next, and in alignment with the BPR plan so that, yes, we're operating the system and we're planning for the future. Recently, the city released results from the National Community Survey. This is a nationwide survey that many communities use to connect with their community members and to hear how they're doing. Boulder is a city and a community that's committed to equity, and there are lots of ways that data continue to improve to hear from the community. And I think we do that with community connectors and so many other ways. But that doesn't diminish some of the statistically valid responses we heard, where over 9 out of 10 community members have rated high the quality of life here in Boulder, including the way the Parks and Recreation system contributes to that. Those results are higher than most of the national benchmarks. And I share that all to say that not only do we operate a really big system, our team does it really well. And so often, certainly as leaders of the department and you all as the board, you hear about the things we're trying to make better. And I think it's important to remember that we're already so good. So with that, I'm going to tell you about some of the things we're doing to be better, but just wanted to remind you that from soccer fields to tennis courts, we have a pretty great system that of course we want to make better. The next slide. So everything we do in the city, we are trying to connect our work always ever better and ever stronger together across departments into the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. The sustainability, equity, and resilience framework is a way that we have summarized as a city the community we want to be. For you all, what's most relevant is that it outlines that we want to be a healthy and socially thriving community. We want to be a livable community. We want to be an accessible and connected community. And there's measures and data points for how we see if work is achieving those outcomes. You guys will hear us talk about that. I'm going to talk most about, so departmental strategic plans, formerly known as master plans. The city is working on eliminating that term for connotations and the way it conflicts with our equity goals. So what previously you would hear us call the Boulder Parks and Recreation Master Plan, you'll hear us call the BPR 2022 plan. That is what guides all of our work. And every year we look at it to say, okay, what are we going to do to advance our work? Every year we have an action plan and our teams have work plans. And then every single individual on our team has goals that show their role in connecting all of this. Another graphic on the next slide that you've seen before, just as a reminder, you see the rings around this. This started with the 2022 BPR plan. This is the framework and the icon really for every decision that we make, that it's rooted in sustainability, equity, and resilience, and informed by three critical things: community engagement, data, and policy. It can never be just one, because one person's opinion may conflict with research. Research may conflict with our community. Courts is a really great example of that. If we just use data and benchmarks from other communities, we'd tell our folks, you're fine. But we know that they swim, they play tennis, they do lots of things at higher numbers than national averages. So it's that synthesis of the input from the community, the data, and the policy that guides our decisions. So you've already heard me talk on the next slide. Just as a reminder, we have a recent in city speak, we have a 2-year-old this summer in our BPR plan. And with that plan, we committed that it wouldn't sit on the shelf, that we actually would capture the significant amount of time and investment from both our community and our staff in developing that document. So every year we look at that and we decide what's most important next. And I'm going to start with something you are seeing for the first time, something we're very excited about. This is the iconography for our CAPRA project. You've heard us talk about CAPRA before. That is the accreditation by the Commission for the Commission for the Accreditation of Parks and Recreation Agencies. We're really excited about this graphic because we think it captures why we are doing this project. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. First of all, we're using the slogan BPR Shines, because that when you look in the thesaurus and look at all the things that shine means, it means to excel, to stand out, or to have a gift for. And that's the department that we want to be. It can mean to glow or to gleam, and we know that our teammates shine. It also acknowledges the abundant sunshine in our community. That and the Flatirons remind us that everything we do is rooted in our community. The people in this graphic demonstrate that really for us, accreditation is about the professional development and the learning that is going to come, and the culture affirmation. We have incredible teammates in our department, and through accreditation, we're going to strengthen the tools we provide them for onboarding, for implementing. The fee policy you all approved in 2023 is a great example of that. You might have heard me say that had you joined our department in 2019 and said, Allie, how do I set fees? I would have said, read these 10 PRAB memos and figure it out. And now, as you all know, we have a concise and all in one place fee policy and fee schedule. The path demonstrates that this is a journey for us, that it's about developing resilience and continuous improvement. The first step in process improvement is to document your current process. And we're excited that through this project, we'll be driving innovation. And the CAPRA flag there on the top of the second flag just recognizes that CAPRA is the industry standard of excellence for parks and recreation. There are over 10,000 agencies in the United States that could be CAPRA accredited, and less than 200 are. We know that our community expects high quality parks and recreation, and for us, achieving this excellence will help show that. So how are we going to do it when we have so much work to do operating our system? If you go to the next slide, Rosa, matrix teams are something that many private industry companies used, and we've used in Boulder Parks and Recreation to drive work. In a matrix team, you have teammates who are in different functions at different levels and in different areas of the department, and they all report to a project lead to do the work. Every matrix team has project-based work with a clear scope, objectives, and timeline. There'll be learning opportunities for team members where they can lead the work, they can report out on the work, they can teach the work. So the professional development out of this is huge. And it's really going to increase information flow across the organization, because you have folks from park operations working with folks in recreation planning, and natural lands, and just across the system. So on the next slide is just a summary. I'm not going to read you all of this, but there is a team for the major chapters of CAPRA. So CAPRA has 84 standards that are aligned around chapters. These ones up here are the major chapters. Chapters 1, 2, and 3 are really around administration and planning. And we're calling them minor chapters because we achieve them just today without doing any additional work. Just by documenting the work that we do, we've achieved those standards with some minor improvements. We have an entire chapter around the way we onboard, train, and support our teammates, recreation service, maintenance, safety, and quality. I want to call out those 2 teams at the bottom. They're not connected to CAPRA, but they're so critical to our work. They are matrix teams in 2024. Summer Squad is what we had last year. It's where we have folks working across the department to make sure we can hire the hordes of people we need to deliver peak summer fun safely. So that team is already in motion and planning for 2024. We hope to have another banner year. And then we have a safety committee. So you'll notice that chapter 8 of CAPRA is about law and risk management and safety and security. That's really about making sure you have the standard operating procedures and a general security plan. The safety committee is about making sure our teammates know it and about making sure we're reviewing workplace incidences and teaching folks. So if I were to summarize, chapter 8 is about what we do, and the safety committee is how we do it and live it. Last, just to summarize, you've had this in your consent agenda already, but where we asked everyone in the operations for their work plans for 2024, typically everybody would have their own individual work plan that would be the work they do, and then any projects for their area that might be coordinated across the department. For example, one year we had a whole group of folks improve their onboarding for seasonals. So if you're in operations, your work plan is basically anything you're committed to for service delivery plus CAPRA. And then planning does have some functions with CAPRA, but if you will go to the next slide, Rosa, we've got some really big projects, either in the hangar and heading toward the runway or in the runway. So in the contracting stage are North Boulder Park and the civic area. We've talked about both of those a couple of times. You just heard an update on the court system plan, and that'll move to completion in Q2. We are scoping now the future of the rec centers, and I'm glad I sent you all an email about a week ago on some exciting updates there as it looks to just how do we think for the next 50 years of our community. There's this incredible, in my mind, just significance to the fact that it was in 1973 that our community first approved funding for North and South. And then it was 30 years ago that they first contemplated funding for East. And so we're at this critical milestone of what does it look like for the next 50 years to meet our community needs? So you're going to hear a lot more about that in Q2 and in scoping. But for now, I think if a community member were to ask you, what is Parks and Recreation doing? You can say they are contemplating these major legacy conversations with the thoroughness and thoughtfulness that they require. We are not going to be shovels in the ground tomorrow. And I know for some folks that's frustrating, but you don't plan for 50 years in a day. Flatirons Golf Course, going to be open this summer, and I cannot wait till we have you all out there. I believe it's next month that we're coming to you on Pleasant View. Yes, next month we'll be talking about both Pleasant View and Violet. So soon we're going to be talking about Pleasant View and Violet. So really the intent of this was just so you to understand. Again, I know as members of the board, sometimes you get questions from the community, and hopefully this provided some helpful information. And if you have any questions, Scott will answer them.
Thank you. We'll open it up for any questions or comments, starting with Jason.
Nothing for me. I like the logo a lot. It's very cool. But thanks for those updates, Ellie.
I'm calling on you, Jason, just to make sure you're still
Yeah, no,
checked in there. Good.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Getting a little late back on the East Coast. I have a quick question about the CAPRA process. Is this going to be ongoing and recurring, continuing into the future? Or is this a one-time, once you get certification, you're done, you renew every 10 years? How does that work?
Sure. So this, thank you. So this will be our first time through this to become certified. And once we become certified, we will have to, and our hope is that we're able to accomplish that by fall of 2025. After that process, then we'll go through and do reaccreditation. I believe it's every 5 years. So but we will have established some very strong foundational pieces as part of this initial process. So this is the big lift. And from there, it's just continuous improvement.
That's perfect. What I'll add is that I've learned from talking to colleagues is that there's annual reporting. So you can't just be status quo for 5 years and then, just update dates. Like they're actually getting, the commission is very rigorous around, this was your service delivery model in 2020. This is in 2025. Have you reflected changing times? Are you, it really is about continuous improvement, and you don't get to just buy.
Thanks. This sounds very similar to the academic accreditation process. So I used to be a professor at University of Denver in engineering, and we had to do accreditation and renew it every 5 years. So I'm very familiar with the process and how much energy and effort it takes. So congratulations to getting the first accreditation is a big step. And then once you have a process in place, the next ones are easier until you sort of have a rhythm developed. And so setting the framework and groundwork now really pays off in the long run. So congratulations on doing that so well.
Maybe we'll have to go for a walk and you can share with me your lessons. It is fascinating as I talk to folks in the public works field, like accreditation is common in most local government industries, but it's rare in Colorado and in the city for departments to be accredited. So we're looking forward to excelling.
Great. Okay, we are going to move on to matters from the board. We'll start with discussing when we're going to have our meeting in March.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to take a quick bio break and be right back.
Okay.
I don't think you guys need me to talk about, or I'll be right back.
I don't know what to talk about. Like, I don't know when our meeting's planned or, okay, Rosa.
So Chuck, I noticed that our March meeting falls on the first day of BVSD spring break. And so I don't know if some of the families would want to go away or, have that week off. So we might want to move it to earlier in March.
I think that's very advisable. I'm sure there'll be lots of people gone. Jason, do you think you'll be available or?
Yeah, I'd prefer to move it up a week or back a week.
Okay.
I will be out of town.
What days are currently scheduled, Rosa?
I believe it's March 25th.
So moving it to March 18th would be a possibility. And would you have a problem with that, Bernie?
Should be fine.
Okay. Why don't we tentatively plan on that? Would you mind sending an email out to all the members of the board and confirming that, see if anyone has a problem with that? Because we have a limited number of people right now. We're going to be down one member.
And I'll confirm that we have the council chambers as well. Otherwise, we can meet downstairs.
Okay. So we're talking about moving the March meeting, which falls during the Boulder Valley School District spring break, up a week. So instead of being on March 25th, having it on March 18th.
Okay. Either way is fine.
Okay.
So I'll reiterate this in an email and confirm location.
That'd be
Thank you.
fabulous.
Okay.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, next up is board membership. So as we heard at the beginning of this meeting, Anita Spears has stepped down from the board effective immediately, meaning that we'll have another vacancy. In some ways, it's advantageous that she did it now because we have time for people to apply through the process that the board and the board and committee process. So that means we have another opening to fill, and hopefully we can all make an effort to find good people in our community who we think would be good members of the board and ask them to apply. So ask around your circle of friends, acquaintances, colleagues, people that you think would be good.
Chuck, I wanted to add that the application period ends on the 29th of this month.
Right. So basically 1 week. Not much time. And there's an online questionnaire to answer. So it does take a bit of time.
Are you able to share anything more about why Anita resigned?
I mean, I am taking a leap of faith, and I think that she would be comfortable sharing that she just found, one, she has an opportunity for some extended learning, which she's very excited about. And as the primary caregiver for her daughter, evenings were pretty challenging for her. But it sounds like she had an opportunity for some learning that she's really excited about. And it was, the schedules were conflicting.
Thank you.
And just for the record, we'll miss having her on the board and the input that she gave us. So good luck, Anita. Okay, next up, we have Prab Matters. So this is a chance to bring up any topics that you've heard from the community or any issues that you think are appropriate for discussing in this setting. Okay, hearing nothing, we'll move on. And we have added a item which is discussing the agenda for the retreat. And Sunny and Jason are in charge of the retreat agenda. So if Jason is prepared and awake, it'd be great to hear from him on what the agenda is looking like.
I am awake, but barely. So I actually, to be honest, Sunny and I connected earlier today on this. I don't think she's at this meeting tonight. So we still have time to do some planning, but we have a list of things that have been talked about, but I don't know. And maybe it's because I've been remote for 2 meetings in a row, but I don't know that we have settled on an actual topic. Last year when I think Ellie and I worked on the retreat, we actually had, if you recall, I think it was before Bernie joined, but and I guess Anna as well, we had a kind of deeper dive into 2 specific issues. So this one, I just have a list that Rosa sent along of things that have been talked about. And so happy, to open it up to any ideas. And then Sunny and I can take those and start planning in a little more detail. Rosa, if I'm just going to read from the list you sent us, if that's okay. Some of it seems dated maybe, but I'll read it all. BPR equity work, including water safety access. I know, and I think you've mentioned that in the past. Board and commission report debrief and discussion. Prab handbook deep dive. That I don't know if that's necessary anymore since we've already approved that, but defer to others if people want to spend some time on that. Prab's role and authority. We kind of touched on this a little last year. We could do that again. And then Prab process. So those are the 5 things that we have as potential agenda items. But we can open this up for discussion. Take some more, or just get in, or take this in a different direction. I don't have any strong feelings on either way. I think I'm just here mostly to advise Sunny, who I think is really taking the lead on this. Or maybe not, maybe the 2 of us together.
So from my perspective, I think having a really thorough discussion of the equity work that is ongoing in the department would be fabulous. And I think one element of that is the question of swimming training for all Boulder children as a desired equity outcome. So I would definitely like to see those 2 items discussed.
I agree with the equity issue. I think it's a good use of our time.
I also support the equity theme and the universal swim. Thank you.
Can I ask a little more on that to help us make sure we support are you looking for and I guess maybe we'll follow up with Jason and Sunny. What we did last year on the 2 topics you did a deep dive on is I think we did a 10-minute presentation and then you all had some discussion time to talk about it. Is that about the format, what you all are looking for? We didn't write any memos. We just did this is something you are curious about and you wanted to talk about. It hasn't necessarily aligned with the agenda. So here's an overview and then you had a discussion.
I think that worked well last year, and it hopefully minimized the amount of work you all have to do. Just something, some basic background, open up for discussion, and then go from there. But I think that format worked last year really well.
So the equity questions I have are where the income cutoffs are and how those are chosen, things like that. I'm very interested in gradation of financial support as opposed to a hard cutoff at a particular income level, because if you earn $1 more than that, you suddenly don't qualify for any support, even though your needs have not changed by more than 0.001%. So being prepared with that kind of information, how many people are helped, what the demographics look like. I'd be very interested in those kinds of things. Who's not being served? What the community needs are that you've heard.
So what I'm hearing a lot of questions are around our financial aid programming. And so I just again, to make sure we're meeting the questions are not around equity and decision-making with planning. I think you hear that a lot in the projects. It's really on the operational side. I'm hearing these questions.
That's my main concern. I don't know if Anna agrees with that or if she's more interested in a broader look at it.
I'll let the other members talk about their interests here.
Jason, do you have any further comments on what you?
Yeah, I actually, I'm glad you raised the, I think this kind of gets a little bit, maybe it gets broader, but it's a good part of the equity discussion of just the kind of, I know we've talked about this before, I've raised this before, financial aid and the thresholds and kind of moving to more of a sliding scale. You know, I know that there's been, we've talked about this at various points over the years. So, you know, hopefully it's not too much to ask Allie of you and your team, but I'd be interested in kind of looking at that issue again as well.
And I'd like to find out where support for those programs comes from, and what options and opportunities there might be for expanding programs and income.
Yeah, everything you all have said, I believe, and we can confirm with the team and get back to you if there's any challenges. I believe we report on, and because a lot of what we're talking about gets grant support, that can help drive really good documentation, data, analytics. The one I heard that is a bigger ask around sliding scale. So that is an initiative we would love to address. It's outlined in the 2022 BPR plan. It is not in our work plan for this year. And so to develop that this year would mean taking something off the table.
Gotcha. I think I'd like to have a discussion on what that might look like, though, at least, and put it on your radar. Regarding the deep dive into the PRAB handbook, I agree. I don't think that's necessary. I think it might be useful to have sort of a brief reminder of some of the basic rules of recusal, what we can comment on, how we communicate with council. You know, something sort of a 5-minute reminder, I think would be appropriate, just to remind everyone the handbook exists, make sure you read it, refresh everyone's memory on it, and then move on.
Yeah, that's up to you all. We could, Jason mentioned the PRAB role piece. I don't.
Yeah, that's in the handbook.
In October of 22, we have a very brief 8-slide deck that we could send to folks and they can ask questions that might serve. And we can talk to, I know Rosa's coordinated with Jason and Sunny, and if we can support that, we're happy to.
Okay. What do you think, Jason?
Yeah, that sounds good. And we also, I think last year and previous years, we did some, you know, kind of icebreakers and get to know you games, and it was fun. We'll try to come up with some new ideas again this year.
Yeah, I remember the question about what's your hidden pleasure for music. That was a good one. Your secret pleasure for music, for a road trip or something like that. Luckily, it did not involve much singing, thankfully. Okay, is there anything else under PRAB matters?
What, just timing wise, Allie and team, when do you all need kind of a final agenda to do your planning? Very soon, this retreat.
I'm just popping up the calendar. So what I am hearing from you all is that you don't need 40-page memos for us on any of this. that it would be an overview and information that we can share that evening. So what we want to do is publicly notice the meeting and the agenda. And I think the code, and Rosa can confirm, is just that we do that 24 hours in advance. It is our practice to post things on the Wednesday before, which would be the 31st in a week from this Wednesday. But I think we have some wiggle room. And if we had a final agenda by the 2nd and posted that, that would comply with open records laws and let the public know that you're having a retreat. And of course, there wouldn't be public comment at a retreat, but folks are welcome to it. Anytime you meet, it's open to the public. So.
Okay, that's doable. We're talking this week, so we can get signed to you by then.
And the date is the 4th or the 5th? 5th.
Fifth.
Okay, thank you. And do we know where the retreat will be held? Here? Okay. Is it possible to meet downstairs where there's a circular table or a little less formal environment? Great, thank you very much. Anything else, Jason?
No, thanks for raising that, because it's better to have a more collegial room than the council chambers. So appreciate that.
Those chairs are way better than these chairs.
Okay, nothing else on the agenda. May I, the next board meeting will be, well, we have our retreat on February 5th, and then we'll have a February 26th board meeting. We'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor, aye? Aye. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.